Hey guys, so today I want to report on what neoliberalism is. So, in a couple of my videos, I've talked about, the neoliberal problem and the neoliberal coalition that you have in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So, I actually want to define what neoliberalism is. So that way we all have some understanding together of why it's a bad thing, but more importantly, where it came from, why it exists, and why we need to basically reform it and remove it as a viable economic philosophy. So, neoliberalism is neither new nor is it innately really liberal. It was born in the period of time of the 50s and 60s from philosophical thinkers that adopted quasi-anarcho-capitalist beliefs that were neither completely anarchistic nor were they completely capitalist. I know this sounds really complicated, but all simply is that neoliberals believe that the markets, on their own, unconstrained, would be able to produce a society, a socioeconomic system within society that would provide for the benefits and the welfare of the public without too much government interference. And in fact, government interference is one of the main reasons why the economy and the social standing within the society is where it's at the time. So why did neoliberalism why did it become such a popular theory? Why is it the dominant theory in the United States? Well, simply put, the main reason why it is a dominant theory in the United States is the fact that the boomer generation, as well as the silent generation, all came to a conclusion during the 1950s and the 1960s that socialism was government action. Whenever the government acted on something, or whenever government did something, that was socialist. Why? Because the largest quote-unquote socialist Marxist entity that we knew of at the time was the Soviet Union. And that's what Joseph Stalin basically claimed, that basically when the government did something, it was a socialist act. Even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary to that, it didn't matter. And so capitalists and other right-wing thinkers who were against concepts of collective economic populism basically used that in their propaganda against socialist activities. So liberalism is how most Americans identify themselves. Whether they are conservative or quote-unquote American liberal, both conservatives in this country and the leftists in this country all identify with some basic innate understanding of liberalism and liberal traditions and institutions such as democracy, the press, etc., etc. Neoliberalism has nothing really to do with the concepts of democracy, and is more focused on the notions of corporate rights and government behavior. And simply put, it was a economic philosophy that allied very reactionary right-wing beliefs when it came to the labor movement and the social movements that existed at the time, with kind of a new, sexy kind of paint added on top of it. It's pretty much the same old theories that have been spouted since the mid-19th century by laissez-faire capitalists at the time, who essentially said that the moment government gets involved in anything, it goes to crap. It just is a failure. And this is largely due to the fact that in this period of time in the 60s, particularly late 60s, there was an overall sense of frustration and regret with the governments of the Western world, particularly in the United States. For about 5 years, the United States had engaged in a very brutal and prolonged war in Vietnam. The Cold War was at a fever pitch, and people in the Western world were feeling that their governments were no longer taking into consideration their needs and their interests. All the while, the social security nets, although beneficial, were not inclusionary to all the citizens of the Republic. So the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement that came out of the 1950s and the 1960s was a direct result of the fact that the New Deal was not offered to them the same way it was offered to, generally white men and white families, or what we'd consider mainstream families. So neoliberalism basically was a response to the new wave of economic populism that was beginning to grow in the United States, that was more inclusionary and more multicultural, I guess would be the way to put it. I don't necessarily want to define it that way. It was becoming more and more. It was more and more of a mixed system. Simply put, the labor movement was now in a position where it was now struck with this new rising reality of that women were entering the workforce in a way they hadn't before. And this was not the result of just women's lib. This was also a result of the economic conditions that were happening in the United States. So what was happening in the United States in the 1960s? What was happening in the United States in the 1960s is that the United States was beginning to adjust to the economic reality of the global world. The Soviet Union had ended its Stalinist practices for the most part. I mean, Stalinism still was very much a part of the ethos of the Soviet Union, but many of the Soviets were trying to basically dismantle the totalitarian state to a degree so that people in the Soviet Union were not, being rounded up and slaughtered in the millions because they were made up of the dissenting groups of people. I'm not going to say the Soviet Union completely ended its brutal practices. It continued them, but it was far more marginal and on the periphery. Khrushchev in the 1960s did a lot to try to undo the harm between the relationships of the non-Russian Soviet peoples in the Caucasus, in Eurasia, and in the western provinces of the Soviet Union, with mitigating effects. I mean, it didn't fix all the problems, and more so, he tried to undo the damages caused by Stalin's very heavy-handed and militaristic practices in Poland and the other Warsaw Pact nations. This also had marginal success. So in the late 1960s, the Soviet peoples the people in the communist bloc were becoming more and more agitated by the structural conservative Communist Party that was less inclined to work with them. And so you saw a rise of liberalism, or at least quasi-liberalism, in the Warsaw Bloc countries. This forced the Soviet Union to, quote, crack down on these liberal uprisings that threatened the Warsaw Pact's adhesion to the Soviet economic model. So, in a very simple way, the world economy was recovering. And the reason why I'm using the Soviet countries as an example of this is that when we imagine like the worst economies in the world, people tend to think of either third world countries or the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But even in Eastern Europe, the standard of living was beginning to rise again, access to technology was beginning to rise, and there was an overall sense of economic stability, if not economic prosperity. Europe, on the other hand, was going through a mini boom. European countries' economies had finally recovered from the horrors of World War II, and were beginning to flex their economic muscles in a way they hadn't before. The French, the Western Germans, and the Italians, as well as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, basically decided that they were going to form an economic coalition. This is the earliest stages of what we'd call the EU, and overall it's actually a very beneficial policy that allowed for cheap access to resource, of energy, and just an overall sense of economic harmony between these countries. They wouldn't compete against one another, would instead compete against the rest of the world. This actually, in turn, prosperously impacted the French, the German, and the Italian economies, and it led to actually some sense of prosperity and stability. The British, on the other hand, was going through a whole other problem. They were still in this 30-year-long recession that they hadn't been able to get out of. The slump was still there. Now, there's many reasons why this recession existed, and one of which was the fact that both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party were unwilling to invest in certain programs and, reform the system to a degree that would basically allocate resources to better education. The Labour Party was more interested in its labor identity than it was in trying to develop and cultivate a labor middle class. They instead focused on working class ethos, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. But when you're trying to develop a modern economy and get it out of the economic slump that it was in, you need people going to college, and you need people who have an understanding of electronics and technology. And you need to find a way to innovate your industries to a point so that you're actually competitive. But that's once again something as a side note. So I would dare say in the United States, in Western Europe, And even in some fringes of the Eastern European Soviet bloc states, you began to see a rise. You begin to see the rise of liberalism in these countries because the economy is finally stabilizing. For the last 2 decades, the United States, the British, the French, the Italians, and the Western Germans, in some way, shape, or form, were influenced by democratic socialist economic philosophies, as well as Keynesian economic philosophies, which basically led to a general sense of prosperity and stability. Social safety nets were constructed, but they were not inclusionary to everyone within the populace, and furthermore, the old problems of old Europe and the United States, such as racial tensions and gender inequality, and things of that nature began to rear their head. Why? Because when you're stable and prosperous, people want to participate in it. You know, people have eyes, they have ears, and so they see that everybody else is doing better and they're still stuck in a slump. They want an explanation. So the real reason why I'm bringing this up is that neoliberalism was a result to this, and it was something that came out of the failings of the Keynesian democratic socialist economic philosophies of the 1960s and 1950s. Now, I don't want to say democratic socialists had a huge control or a huge influence on the economy. Keynesianism, the Austrian school, and traditional liberal economic philosophies are far more affluent in the West due to the Red Scare, particularly in the United States, of the rise of communism, which, if anybody here had any real firm understanding of communist history and why communism rose up out of the ranks of the Russian peoples, then you would find that really laughable. But that's neither here or there. That's a subject that I can talk about in another video, why it's really laughable to think that the United States would have fallen to communism the way the Soviet Union had. But simply put, neoliberals were made up of a coalition of people that were fed up with pro-labor, working class, and even some sense middle class socioeconomic policies that were primarily focused on benefiting their quality of life and their standard of living. And this is the coalition of the creditors, the bank owners, the people that are in the financial sector, the corporate interests. They had been marginalized, for a long period of time by the New Dealers, and their response was, "Hey, we're basically stuck with these inflationary policies that are eating away at our financial revenues, and the labor movement has essentially held us at a standstill. We can't, in any way, shape, or form, control the labor movement anymore in the United States because you have such a high skill set and you have such an organized institution that if these corporations tried to force policy changes that the union didn't like, they'd strike. And if these corporations tried to implement policies and push legislators to crack down on unions, then the union coalition, the solidarity that existed primarily in the Rust Belt of the United States, now Rust Belt of the United States, but the Iron Belt at the time, and the labor organizations in the Western United States, they'd push back, and the political solidarity would push back. Why is that important? Well, that's important because that meant that corporate interests had to negotiate with the labor movement in order to get things done. People might not like that, but that was a way of keeping a good standard of living, a good income base, and a lot of benefits, as well as job security, and as well as providing for a safer working environment. Well, the creditor class revolted, and simply put, they began to back more right-wing politicians, people that would otherwise be identified as right centrists adopted a very anti-union, I would say, democratic socialist or New Deal positions, and they basically came up with economic theories. I mean, Milton Friedman's arguments that you got in the 1970s, 1980s was no more different than what you got in the 1890s and the 1880s or the 1870s. It was no different at all. It's the same economic theories, just put in a different, or I guess more modern context. And the same problems with those economic theories that existed in the Gilded Age are the same problems that we're dealing with now. There's no mechanism to force trickle down in a trickle-down economic system. So, simply put, Milton Friedman and the neoliberals that were basically acolytes to the same philosophy simply said that government regulation was bad because government regulation kills businesses, which is not necessarily true. Government regulations don't destroy businesses. Government regulations basically force companies to mitigate their profits to a certain degree to invest in these safety standards that the government imposes on them. There's, to date, no real strong evidence to suggest that government regulations destroyed jobs. Businesses don't go out of business because of hefty taxes in the United States. Businesses go out of business in the United States either to an uncompetitive market or to poor decisions. And I think the former impacts the market more than the latter. And so what does that mean? Why did all of a sudden American businesses feel more and more threatened? Why did we see a decline of small American businesses? Because another core tenet of neoliberalism was to deregulate the financial sector. And surely but surely, localized banks as well as regional banks began to grow more and more autonomous from their regulators. And by the time you got to Ronald Reagan, a new economic philosophy was born in the financial sector. And this is tied to neoliberalism. It's that predatory lending is more profitable. And your fiduciary responsibility to your stockholders, if you're a bank or any kind of business, is to be profitable. So what you saw in the United States is a rise of credit being lent, but a far more, I would say, severe and predatory system was in place. So when you got a loan for the bank was in some ways kind of hoping that you would fail. Why? Because they'd be able to basically take all your assets, everything you invested in, all your labor, all your investment in the property that you purchased and the equipment that you purchased, and then they'd be able to lend it out to someone else or give it out to someone else. So, that was profitable. And if you were successful, they tended to try to find a way to either buy you out so that they could sell it to a far more profitable and have this profitable enterprise on their own and give it to someone else. Well, very quickly, people began to figure out in the markets that it was almost easier just to completely strip down companies to their bare bones, selling off assets of high quality, well-named brands and well-known enterprises, strip them down to bare bones, and once they fail, basically pulling out just before the house of cards falls to the ground. I mean, Bain Capital with Mitt Romney is a perfect example of neoliberal economic philosophy. I mean, it's a die-in-the-wool way of how you manage things. It's a financial sector. It's for profit. It basically makes businesses more competitive, quote unquote. And what that really means is that businesses that they actually want to invest in are businesses that are going to be increasingly more and more autonomous. It's going to be very top-down. It's going to be a very top-down system where Bain Capital is going to have a absolute control of what happens. And the moment the business ceases to be of use to it, it's going to gut it for all it's worth and then pull out. While everybody who was involved in these enterprises basically are left holding the bag, such as the employees, the managers, and the customers. So that's neoliberalism. That right there. What you guys just heard is one of the core tenets of neoliberalism. The other tenet is basically taking care of labor. And one of the best ways you could do that is by basically opening up, quote-unquote, free trade. Free trade. Which simply means that businesses will be allowed to import resources externally of the United States, produce them outside the United States, produce them outside the United States, then sell said products in the United States as if it was produced in the United States. That's the core concept of NAFTA. That's the core concept of the World Trade Organization. That's the result of these free trade deals. Now, these free trade deals were one of the last things that happened in the neoliberal agenda, because you had to liberate the financial sector in order to get the financial backing to support said programs. Otherwise, a lot of corporate entities would resist it. But by the time the 1980s came to an end, most of our corporations were owned by the financial sector. The CEOs and the stockholders were not made up of people who were interested in building cars or building anything of that nature. They were made up of financial wizards or financiers, people who are stockholders or were well connected, who wanted to basically make as much money or much profit off of these enterprises as possible. So basically, everybody that exists in the corporate world right now is taught as a fundamental, almost religious truth that you got to make money at the end of the day. And if it means you have to screw over your employees, move your job overseas, you got to do whatever it takes to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility as the CEO or the stockholders or the board of executives or whatever title you want to give to the executive arm of the corporate machine, to make as much money as possible. So that's why you saw the shortcomings. And the reason why they're able to do that is because in the 1970s, the Democratic Party turned on labor. Yeah, we like to talk about Ronald Reagan and how he destroyed labor, but a lot of this is just a dodge. The Democratic Party was the one that stuck its knife in the back of organized labor. The Republican Party for decades, even during the New Deal, was not a pro-union party. It never had been. Even TR, who was a guy that is seen as legitimizing the labor movement, never really fully extended his hand to the labor movement. He offered it in some kind of sense of national populism and these as being common American workers, but he never allied himself with the union institutions themselves. He'd allow unions to vote for him, and he'd try to create, quote unquote, a fair and balanced system between corporations and the labor movement, but he never extended his arm to them. FDR did. FDR is the one that basically opened his arm and brought the union infrastructure into the Democratic Party. And this was a considerable boon to the Democratic Party because this was a very organized institution to begin with. And they would be incredibly loyal to them and would vote for them time in and time out, just as long as they'd be able to maintain the coalition and maintain the trust with these union organizations. By the time the 60s happened, though, we had a handful of years with a Northern Democrat from Boston named John F. Kennedy, who expanded our foreign policy and our imperial agenda around the world, and I would call it that because I have no idea where our national interests in Vietnam was, but in a sense of empire, we couldn't have one of these regions possibly fall to a opposite or an opposed economic philosophy, so that the resources in that country would not be available to the Western Europeans at a price that they wanted. Once again, I'm getting a little off track there. Simply put, Kennedy was not a pro-labor guy. Johnson was more pro-labor than Kennedy, and Johnson was a Southern Democrat. He was a New Deal Democrat. But he was by no means a good friend of the unions or laborers. And he was constantly dealing with the struggle of the conservative Southern Democrats pulling on his heel, and seeing as he was a Democrat from the South, particularly Texas, he had to find continual ways to broker with them. But simply what ended up happening, though, is that Lyndon Johnson, with his Great Society, was able to win over a lot of the poor whites that existed in the United States. But he was not able to bring the conservative Democrats along with him. So he lost a lot of Southern populism that Nixon was able to garner. Now, the funny thing about Nixon was really one of those really strange characters in American history, and I mean that, where he ran on a neoliberal policy. He was going to, take on the miscegenators, the troublemakers, the loud minority that was just causing problems for everybody. But Nixon entering in office had a very strong Democratic coalition facing up against him, made up of new Democrats who were neoliberals but were anti-war and were more pro-civil rights, and New Dealers who I think were neutral on civil rights. That they just didn't, whatever benefited the community was great. Whoever would vote for them, great. But we're more interested in maintaining the regulations and the social safety nets, and the economic order that had been created after and before World War II during the Great Depression, during the New Deal, and after World War II with Truman. Well, this immediately kept them at odds with their New Democrats, because the New Democrats saw that as just, once again, government high-mindedness and heavy-handedness. And so, in a very strange way, the left in the United States, or at least the new left, the New Democrats, became anti-New Dealers. They were with Ronald Reagan and many of these other people who saw it as just government interference, government heavy-handedness. And so they bought into the narrative that government regulations was just hurting the economy. And with the slump of the 1970s happening, this just seemed as, prophetic and as a honest assessment of what had happened. So why on earth did that happen? Why on earth did the United States go into recession in the 1970s? Well, there's many reasons, but one of them is the fact that the U.S. economy was no longer investing or adapting into the new economic world that existed at the time. Both Japan, Germany, the French, the Italians, and the Brits were beginning to produce again, which meant that created competition. And everybody basically was dealing with a little bit of a slump as well. The recession that had hit the British now seemed to hit the United States and the rest of the Western industrialized world. Richard Nixon, who was the last liberal or last reformer quasi-New Deal president we had, was kicked out of office in disgrace with Watergate. And so in the 70s, a whole new coalition formed, and it was a coalition of conservative Democrats from the South and New Democrats in the North, with the Republican Party that was trying to basically find its new identity. And so the New Democrats and the conservative Democrats of the South were not going to amend anything, and the New Dealers, who were basically trying to be a neutral party and getting the conservative Democrats and the New Democrats to sit down at the same table to get economic and social policies implemented, were basically jettisoned by both sides. And so what you got is the struggle between the new social liberals, or liberal Democrats, of the New Democrats, and the social conservative Democrats of the South. And the Republican Party pounced on that. And so by the time we got to the 1980s, the creditor class and the neoliberal movement now had a prime opportunity, not just the United States, but a lot of Western European countries, where social conservatives and liberal conservatives, who made up the bulk of the voting populace, were beginning to reject the Keynesian and democratic socialist perspectives of the New Deal, and at the same time were beginning to adopt a new economic belief in the financial sector and the creditor class, and building up and fixing the economies. And so for a very brief period of time in the 80s, you saw a little bit of a boom, more a result of explosion of technology in the tech industry, and the innovation and actually the cost savings that came with said technology on the margins. But it's not surprising to me that by the time you got into the 90s, the world was dealing with a recession again. And we've now entered again the cycle of boom and bust, because neoliberalism is the same economic philosophy that predated the New Deal. There's nothing new about it. It's just, the only thing new about it is it's got a new coat of paint on it, but it's the same exact thing. It's the same exact car. And every so often it's going to bust down on you, and you're going to have to spend a ton of money and a ton of resources in fixing it. And that's simply what the New Deal is. So I know this seems a little complicated and long-winded, but simply the neoliberalism was the result of a socio-political reality that was born in the United States due to a mix of the creditor class, the investor class, as some would like to call them, frustration with its lack of profitability or maximizing profitability in the Western world, and basically new leftists and the new boomer generation's frustration with the old New Dealer generation's social policies, and just an overall sense of what I would say libertarianism when it came to economic and social policies. A new sense of nihilism was directed towards the United States government that we hadn't seen in some time, at least not since the Civil War. And since then, the tax system has been under control of social conservatives and liberal Democrats, who, for all extensive purposes, have shifted the costs off the backs of the wealthy financial systems and corporate systems and put it on the backs of the middle class and the working class. And so, simply put, for the last 40 years, we've been cutting taxes, and we've been getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And this is the result of neoliberalism. This is the result of the economic system that was born out of this. And what you're beginning to see in the United States and the rest of Western Europe is that everybody's beginning to reject it. But the social conservatives and the liberal Democrats aren't sure what to do because they are so indoctrinated into this line of thinking. They can't possibly conceive any alternatives because Keynesianism was proven wrong, right? Because the 1970s happened. It's not the fact that Keynesianism was a philosophy that was born 50 years beforehand and was responding to the economy that existed at the time. Well, 40 years is a long time, and that means economies change and adapt, and they function differently. And so what ends up happening now is that there's two schools of thought that are beginning to emerge, and that's neo-nationalism. That's something you see with Trump and the National Front with Le Pen, UKIP, and the rise of the alternative Germany, which is a leftist response to this, not quite a neo-Nazi response to it, but you might see a rise of alt-right in Germany. Alt-left and alt-right organizations in Italy, Spain, and Greece have already shown you what's going to eventually happen. And now this leads to the second rise, and that's the rise of the Justice Democrats in the United States, which is the alt-right response. And the alt-right response, I think, in the United States is pluralism. We need to stop investing in one economic philosophy, one-size-fits-all economic theory, because it's been proven illegitimate. It's been proven false. And so I'll talk more about what Justice Democratic economic theory is and what pluralism is in another video that's going to come up next. But this is the reason why neoliberalism is a failing system. This is the reason why Hillary Clinton, who should have won the Rust Belt hands down, lost the Rust Belt to Donald Trump because she was still a neoliberal. And Donald Trump was a neo-national, and it was different, it sounded different, it felt different. And there is a huge downside to neo-nationalism. And I'm going to talk about neo-nationalism and why it's so dangerous and why it's bad in another video as well. But simply put, there is a reason why Bernie Sanders got 47% of the Democratic Party vote as an independent Democratic Socialist from Vermont. And that's because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been marginalized for a long time. And it has evolved from the old New Deal environment and has adopted new concepts when it comes to identity politics as well as notions of social justice. But the same old concepts of economic populism and reform are there. It's just getting the coalition together to respond to the neoliberal establishment, because Donald Trump might be a neo-nationalist, and neo-nationalism might seem very inviting, but at the end of the day, neo-nationalism is going to fall short of the neoliberal establishment, because there's just too much infrastructure there for Donald Trump alone and the neo-nationalists alone, these alt-right and really desperate working-class people would hope to be able to achieve. But like I said, I'll go over that in another time. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.